let's first be clear about why Mr. Naqvi said what he did. So he's not a political philosopher, obviously, or a professor of politics and governance. So it's not like he had been thinking deep about these issues and then decided to speak out his thoughts. The plain and simple fact is that he spoke on cue from the establishment. He is where he is because he's plugged in with the establishment. And by the way, I don't say this as an indictment. I'm just stating a fact. So the day after he said this, we had the DG of ISPR reiterate most of Mr. Naqvi's points. And I don't think that's a coincidence. The lament is, as you mentioned, that the system has collapsed. So why has it collapsed? I think there are three types of legitimacies when it comes to politico-economic systems. So you have what I would describe as input legitimacy, which is a process. And what does it mean? It means that citizens must believe the government represents their will. So how does that happen? It requires genuine political participation, which includes credible elections and institutional trust. So that's one aspect of it. Then you have the output legitimacy, which deals with performance, which essentially means the system must deliver tangible results. It also means rule of law, equitable economic opportunities, physical security, reliable public services, among other things. What we generally call good governance. And then the third leg is structural legitimacy, which is actually the framework. And this is the most important, and the other two flow from it. The state must operate under an accepted constitutional order. This is the essence of rule of law. Laws apply equally to everyone. Now, we are being told that the system has collapsed. It is because it lacks all three fundamentals. It has bypassed input legitimacy through political engineering, which means that except the beneficiaries, others are alienated. It has failed at output legitimacy by focusing on what I would describe as elite-centric survival. And this is something that people have written about. Like, for instance, you try to avoid sovereign default. Okay, you managed to do that. Our friend Khurram Hussain has been writing in Dawn about this. Others have also written about this. But you ignore inflation, lack of infrastructure, job creation, a number of other things. And these are the things that impact the citizen. So by substituting top-down control for constitutional supremacy, the system has eroded its own structural foundation. This, to me, is the essence of why the system has collapsed. And finally, this is not something new. We've been talking about it. You've been talking about it. I don't know for how long, maybe 20 years. I've been talking about it for the last 30 years. And we are not the only two people who have talked about this. A number of other people have talked about it. So there's nothing new about it. Yeah, tag team. Listen, by labeling Naqvi's remarks as a personal view or personal opinion, the establishment obviously seeks to maintain a formal distance from what's been said, ostensibly by a civilian minister. But equally, by validating the need for an administrative reset, it is also signaling that the current system's performance is no longer defensive. So the DG explicitly tied good governance also to national stability, national security. I find this framing very important because it moves governance out of the purely political arena of interest aggregation. And politics is all about aggregating interests, and transforms it into a managerial crisis that requires institutional intervention, possibly by the military. But I'm not surprised because the military operates on the idea of managerial excellence. And by the way, this is not a bad thing, because if the military doesn't if it does not operate on the idea of managerial excellence, it cannot remain effective. When I say it cannot remain effective, I'm talking about their professional domain. But politics, especially in a diverse entity, requires political compromises. And as I said before, it requires aggregating very often conflicting interests. So essentially, what I'm saying is that the two domains are very different. And so if they're different, they need different tools. You cannot run an army without managerial efficiency, and you cannot run a diverse society like an army unit. Now, I can only hazard a guess, which is that this combined messaging signals that the establishment is perhaps preparing grounds to move beyond the current setup. I'm not sure. That doesn't necessarily mean winding up this setup, because it has worked pretty well for the establishment, frankly, up until now. But it could indicate sweeping constitutional or perhaps administrative changes. And here the term reset is instructive, because the power dynamics remain the same. As in, the political elite remains weak and fragmented, but some tweaking here and there is supposed to do the trick. Now, how that might work, frankly, I have no idea. Once again, I have no idea. I have no inside track into the system. Frankly, I haven't even seen this map that you were talking about. There are a number of, and it's not new, by the way. And again, you know that because you have been in business for long enough to know that, these things, whether there should be a parliamentary form of government, whether there should be a presidential form of government, whether we should have more provinces, these are things that keep kind of recurring. I don't even know how much of this is what one could call trial balloons. But what I know for sure is simple, which is that without addressing the fundamentals that I have earlier talked about, no reset or engineering or re-engineering, or call it what you will, is going to work. Tweaking the system without going back to the fundamentals is just tactical stuff. I mean, you can claim a few successes here and there, if at all, but experience tells us that tactical successes may not amount to strategic success. And, frankly, this is a lesson the military should know well, because it forms the basis of the history of war. Once again, as I said, I don't know, this might be a trial balloon. They might be talking about something big in order to create space for something which is not that optimal. I have no idea. But let me give you my view on provinces. I have long held, and I've written about this and spoken about this, that Pakistan needs more provinces. In theory, it is a good idea. In practice, not so much. Now, why do I say that? It has always been a touchy topic, and unfortunately, over decades of poor governance and political machinations, it has become politically very toxic. So, what is the solution? Not do anything? How do you improve governance if you cannot create more provinces? We actually, I think it's been like what, couple of months, 3 months that we're having this discussion at a round table. And I proposed that instead of carving out more provinces from the existing ones, at this point in time, it is better to focus on local governments. And not just local governments as pro forma constitutional requirement, but effective and fiscally empowered local governments. So across the world, in democracies as well as enlightened dictatorships, and when I talk about enlightened dictatorships, I am, as a primary example, we have China. LGs have played a central role in governance, in entrepreneurship, in innovation, and in providing new political leadership. And by the way, effective LGs are not controversial. So my point is that while in theory we should have more provinces, the environment is not conducive for that kind of move at this point in time. So let's go for something which we can do and which can actually give us good results. Because local governments are the most participatory form of democratic governance. That is where the citizen has an interface with the government. And that is where you have proximity. And these are the things that then allow uh, citizens to actually hold their representatives accountable, because they can't do that with the provincial government. They can't do that, certainly can't do that with the federal government. So that's my view of how we should go about this. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the answer is in your question. Obviously. I mean, and not even the Malik government. It has mostly been governed by the establishment. And the template has been what I call the bazaar and the tent. You go to the bazaar, there are a number of tents, and then there is the big tent there. And you go to the big tent and you find the man who occupies the big tent. You make a deal with him and you let him deal with the rest of the bazaar. That has been the operating principle or template, if you will, of how we have dealt with Balochistan. Now, for a long period of time, we were dealing, the tents were where the Sardars sat. But a lot has changed in Balochistan also. This whole Sardari thing is now passe, frankly, because you have a kind of educated middle class, if you will, who obviously are not fond of the federal government, and they want to secede from Pakistan, and they don't have much problem with getting recruitment. So it's a situation that has become very delicate. Now, I once wrote an open letter to the Prime Minister on Balochistan. And my contention has been that Balochistan primarily is a political problem. Now, I'm not saying that there's no violence there. Obviously, there is. There is actually an active insurgency, and that needs to be dealt with. India is also fishing there, as it would. I mean, we have adversarial relations with India, so obviously, if we are in trouble, they'll do whatever they can to hurt us more. That's a no-brainer. But the problem is not caused by India. We have caused the problem, and it is now being exploited by India and perhaps other hostile actors. So, to deny external actors the space to exploit the situation, we have to first deal with issues that have brought the province to the current pass. Now, if we are going to simply flag one side of the problem, we run the risk of avoiding or perhaps ignoring the internal side of the problem. And I think this is where, when we talk about Balochistan, we have to look at counterinsurgency as a subset of the problem. Of course, there's now bidirectional causality also. It has become a wicked problem in many ways. But I still maintain that the primary issue is political. And that has to be addressed first, and not in a sequence. I'm not saying that you address that and then do counterinsurgency later. No, I mean you have to do it simultaneously. But the focus has to be on the political issues. Once you fail at governance, the easiest way out is to brand the issue as a security problem. Now, frankly, I did not want to talk about AJK because A, it requires a separate discussion. Because the problem begins in April 1949 with the uneven Karachi Agreement. And then, one can go step by step. It's a long history of broken promises and poor governance. And I belong to Azad Kashmir. So I know what I'm talking about. But all I would say here, and I think that should be enough to make the point, is that a state that can bring the people of Azad Jammu Kashmir to protest in the way that they are doing does require a major overhaul. Not just the way in which it is being talked about to preserve certain interests, but going back to the drawing board and starting with the fundamentals. It is amazing that people of an area who rose in revolt against the Dogra Raja, who fought for their freedoms, who actually managed to get the territory that we now have in collaboration with certain elements of the Pakistan army at that time in 47, 48. To think that Gilgit-Baltistan, which was wrested from the Dogra Raja by Gilgit scouts, today live in a constitutional vacuum is just plain travesty. But as I said, this is a topic that actually requires a separate discussion. This is a question after my own heart. I was actually a friend of mine who was a professor of sociology wrote this. I was actually having this discussion with him earlier in the day after reading his op-ed in Dawn, where he was talking about this. I'm talking about Umar Javed. And we were having this discussion about, what the higher objective is. But this idea of a hard state, I've been flagging this idea and essentially taking the cue from a brilliant work which was published back in 95 or 96. It's called Overstating the Arab State. And it was written by Nazi Ayubi, an academic, who's unfortunately no more. He introduced a crucial nuance which perfectly explains the paradox of authoritarian regimes, which is the vital difference between a strong state and a hard state. So the strong state possesses high structural capacity. It does not need to constantly brandish weapons because it has deep infrastructural power. And what does that mean? It's the ability to smoothly penetrate society and perform multiple functions, collect taxes fairly, enforce the rule of law, implement policies through organic legitimacy, essentially to successfully aggregate societal consensus. And what does the hard state do? It uses despotic power. So it is bloated but weak. It lacks legitimate authority and economic capability, and it relies entirely on despotic power, which essentially translates to brute force, coercion, tactical rule by law to form compliance. And it can easily lock down a city or silence dissent, but it cannot fix an economy, it cannot collect direct taxes effectively or does so discriminately. It doesn't inspire public trust. Now, I have used two terms, rule of law and rule by law. Now, rule of law is the constitutional principle where the law is supreme. It applies equally to everyone, including the rulers, and actively limits state power to protect citizen rights. That's rule of law. Rule by law is a tactical tool where the ruling elite uses the legal system as a weapon of convenience. So what does that mean? Laws are selectively created, altered, tailored, enforced to suppress dissent and maintain top-down control. And I don't have to tell you what exactly that means because you've been seeing this happen over many years, especially in the last 3 years. So what is the connection to this hybrid collapse? So the hybrid system relies on rule by law, so which is why it treats governance as a managerial exercise. And when it does that, it strips away the input legitimacy that I talked about, which is required to run smoothly. And because it forces compliance rather than aggregating genuine political will, the governance model eventually fractures under economic and social stress. This is why I'm saying that it's not enough to say that the system has collapsed, that it needs a reset. Yes, it has collapsed. In fact, I would say that it never really took off. Yes, it needs a reset. But the essential point is, what kind of reset? Are you going to go back to the fundamentals to see why the system has collapsed or why it could never take off the ground? Because if you're not going to do that, then no matter what you do, it's not going to work. Well, there has been a debate following the 18th Amendment and power being devolved to the provinces. And debate is healthy. There's no doubt about that. But once again, I think by now it should be clear that the problem can't be solved by bringing in more constitutional amendments. I mean, you can have the 28th or 29th or 30th Amendment. So, rule by law remains what it is, rule by law. It can't become rule of law. And in the absence of the fundamentals that I've already listed, no amount of re-engineering can get the country out of its current mess. That's the fundamental thing. I'm constantly stressing this point. Because you can't dance around the problem. You have to take the problem head on. It's not a matter of, getting band-aids and applying band-aids. It has to, if you're really serious about understanding the collapse and then trying to rework the entire thing, then you have to go back to the fundamentals. This is a question the establishment can best answer. I mean, of course, establishment is as much to blame as the venal politicians. As a matter of fact, the venality of our politics has a lot to do with how the establishment has been playing politics in this country. Now, why are they doing what has not worked and repeatedly not worked? Primacy, perhaps, political power, business interests, institutional memory, path dependence, confirmation bias, or a mix of all this? I don't know. Individuals and collections make choices that are bad. Leaders in war, for instance, often what we call gamble for resurrection, even when they know the war is not going well. I mean, Trump is a great example of that right now as we speak. I mean, a person can take to drinking because he thinks he's a loser and then fail all the more because he drinks. It kind of becomes a catch-22. But the essential point is that if the establishment is serious about this, it has to first understand why a system that it engineered itself has collapsed or is collapsing. Because if the basics of, okay, look at it like this. The first thing you have in a four-wheeler is a chassis. And that has to be the fundamental, it's like the plinth on which you build the car or whatever. Now, if your chassis is bad, you can imagine what the vehicle will look like.